Welcome to my channel, Reading Radical Feminism. Welcome back. This is a reading of Chapter 3 for Mary Daly's Gynecology. This is a really difficult chapter. Hopefully you have listened to the earlier videos because Mary Daly has a lot to say to prepare you for the basically horror of this chapter. I mean, it's nice to read a book in order, but if you're new to this, buckle up. Prepare yourself. Okay. Chapter 3. Indian Suttee, the ultimate consummation of marriage. Begin quote. Slow advancing, halting, creeping, comes the woman to the hour. She walketh veiled and sleeping, for she knoweth not her power. End quote. Charlotte Perkins Gilman from She Walketh Veiled and Sleeping in This Our World. Begin quote. I have not deserved it. Why must I die like this, alone with my mortal enemy? End quote. Willa Cather, my mortal enemy. Begin quote. Quote, widow is a harsh and hurtful word. It comes from the Sanskrit and it means, quote, empty. I resent what the term has come to mean. I am alive. I am part of the world, end quote. Lynn Kane, widow. Begin quote. They speak together of the threat they have constituted towards authority. They tell how they were burned on pyres to prevent them from assembling in future. End quote. Monique Wittig, Les Guerrières. The Indian rite of Suttee, or widow burning, might at first appear totally alien to contemporary Western society, where widows are not ceremoniously burned alive on the funeral pyres of their husbands. No. Footnote already. This is a long one. Although Suttee was legally banned in 1829, and despite the existence of other legal reforms, it should not be imagined that the lot of most Indian women has changed dramatically since then, or since the publication of Catherine Mayo's Mother India in 1927. The situation of most widows is pitiable. An article in an Indian paper, the Sunday Standard, May 11, 1975, described the wretched existence of the 7,000 widows of the town of Brindaban, begin quote, the living specters whose life had been eroded by another's death, end quote. These poverty-stricken women with shaved heads and with a single white cloth draped over their bare bodies are forced every morning to chant praise, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, ad nauseum for 4 hours in order to get a small bowl of rice. In mid-afternoon, they must chant for 4 more hours in order to receive the price of a glass of tea. A not unusual case is that of a 69-year-old widow who was married at the age of 9 and widowed at 11. 69-year-old widow. A not unusual case. I'm sorry. Oh my goodness. A not unusual case is that of a 69-year-old widow who was married at the age of 9 and widowed at 11 and has been waiting ever since for the, quote, day of deliverance, end quote. Surveys carried out by an Indian committee on the status of women revealed that a large percentage of the Indian population still approves of such oppression of widows. An Indian woman need not be widowed to be victimized. Many are literally starved to death. An article in an Indian magazine, Youth Times, March 7, 1975, states, begin quote,
Our marriage ceremony puts her 2 steps behind the sacrificial fire, like a puppy that must follow its master. It is a place that spells disaster for millions, for it is a medical fact that the malnutrition and anemia that plague such a vast number of our women have a basis in the habit of the women eating after they have served their husbands, a practice which in poor homes means virtual starvation, end quote.
A look at tables of age-specific death rates is revealing. In 1969, in rural India, it was estimated that 70.2 females per thousand under the age of 4 died, while the death rate for males was 58.3. Since infant mortality generally is higher among males, it is reasonable to believe that these girl children got less to eat or were purposefully starved. The death rate for females is significantly higher in each age group up to the age of 34. Only in India. I mean, nothing against India, but like males die more at every age group. Like in general, so that's really unusual. A number of sources, including Jane, refer obliquely to the high rate of, quote, suicide among women. Jane suggests that suicide, quote, must seem an attractive way out of an intolerable situation, end quote. One way of putting it, Jane is here referring to the victims of the dowry system. So not even what we were just talking about, just another part of Indian culture. The bride is often tormented and pressured to extract more money from her parents. In some cases, she is murdered by her in-laws when her parents fail to come through. On January, this chapter, okay. On January 13th, 1977, the New York Times reported the details of one such murder of a 20-year-old wife who was strangled and burned in kerosene by her husband and in-laws. The article suggested that there are many such, quote, dowry murders, end quote, in India each year, most of them disguised as kitchen accidents. These are occasionally reported in the Indian press in brief notices, as are cases of women murdered for not bearing sons. Although there was a Dowry Prohibition Act in 1961, according to the Sunday Standard, New Delhi, November 10, 1974, it is doubtful whether there has been even one instance of its enforcement. In addition to these horrors, there is high maternal mortality resulting from extremely early marriage, too many pregnancies, maternal malnutrition, and unspeakably filthy and destructive methods of, quote, delivery. We will get to that. End footnote. That was the first sentence in the chapter, and then a whole footnote. So I'm going to just read the sentence again. The Indian rite of Suttee, or widow burning, might at first appear totally alien to contemporary Western society, where widows are not ceremoniously burned alive on the funeral pyres of their husbands. Closer examination unveils its connectedness with, quote, our rituals. Moreover, the very attempt to examine the ritual and its social context through the resources of Western scholarship demonstrates this connectedness. For the scholars who produced these resources exhibit by their very language their complicity in the same social order which was/is the radical source of such rites of female sacrifice, like starving, starvation, murdering your wife when you don't like her, and Suttee. The Hindu rite of Suttee spared widows from the temptations of impurity by forcing them to, quote, immolate themselves,
that is, to be burned alive on the funeral pyres of their husbands. This ritual sacrifice must be understood within its social context. Get it? Since their religion forbade remarriage and at the same time taught that the husband's death was the fault of the widow because of her sins in a previous incarnation, if not this one, everyone was free to despise and mistreat her for the rest of her life. Since it was common practice for men of 50, 60, or 70 years of age to marry child brides, the quantitative surplus of unmarriageable widows boggles the imagination. Wow. Lest we allow our minds to be carried away with astronomical numerical calculations, we should realize that this ritual was largely confined to the upper caste, although there was a tendency to spread downward. We should also realize that in some cases, particularly if the widow was an extremely young child before her husband's unfortunate, for her, death, there was the option of turning to a life of prostitution. Wow, so much better. Which would entail premature death from venereal disease. This, however, would be her only possible escape from persecution by in-laws, sons, and other relatives. As a prostitute, of course, she would be held responsible for the spread of more moral and physical impurity. If the general situation of widowhood in India was not a sufficient inducement for the woman of higher caste to throw herself gratefully and ceremoniously into the fire, she was often pushed and poked in with long stakes after having been bathed, ritually attired, and drugged out of her mind. In case these facts should interfere with our clear misunderstanding of the situation, Webster's invites us to recover women's history with the following definition of Suttee, begin quote, "The act or custom of a Hindu woman willingly cremating herself or being cremated on the funeral pyre of her husband as an indication of her devotion to him," end quote. It is thought-provoking to consider the reality behind the term devotion, for indeed a wife must have shown signs of extraordinarily slavish devotion during her husband's lifetime, since her very life depended upon her husband's state of health. A 13-year-old wife might well be concerned over the health of her 60-year-old husband. Joseph Campbell discusses Suttee as the Hindu form of the widely practiced, quote, custom of sending the family or part of it, quote, into the other world along with the chief member, end quote. The time-honored practice of, quote, human sacrifice, sometimes taking the form of live burial, was common also in other cultures, for example, in ancient Egypt. Campbell writes that Professor George Reisner excavated an immense necropolis in Nubia, an Egyptian province, and found, without exception, quote, a pattern of burial with human sacrifice, specifically female sacrifice, of the wife, and in the more opulent tombs, the entire harem, together with the attendants, end quote. After citing Reisner's descriptions of female skeletons, which indicated that the victims had died hideous deaths of suffocation, Campbell writes, begin quote, "In spite of these signs of suffering and even panic in the actual moment of the pain of suffocation, we should certainly not think of the mental state and experience of these individuals after any model of our own more or less imaginable reactions to such a fate. For these sacrifices were not properly, in fact, individuals at all. That is to say, they were not particular beings, distinguished from a class or group by virtue of any sense or realization of personal, individual destiny or responsibility," end quote. Mary Daly says, I have not italicized any of the words in this citation because it seemed necessary to stress every word. It is impossible to make any adequate comment. At first, Suttee was restricted to the wives of princes and warriors, but as one scholar, Benjamin Walker, deceptively puts it, quote, in the course of time, the widows of weavers, masons, barbers, and others of lower caste adopted the practice, end quote. The use of the active voice here suggests that the widows actively sought out, enforced, and accepted this, quote, practice. Apparently, without any sense of inconsistency, the same author supplies evidence that relatives forced widows to the pyre. He describes a case reported in 1796 in which a widow escaped from the pyre during the night in the rain. A search was made and she was dragged from her hiding place. Walker concludes the story of this woman who, quote, adopted the practice, end quote, as follows, begin quote. She pleaded to be spared, but her own son insisted that she throw herself on the pile, as he would lose caste and suffer everlasting humiliation. When she still refused, the son, with the help of some others present, bound her hands and feet and hurled her into the blaze, end quote. The same author gives information about the numerical escalation of Suttee, begin quote. Among the Rajputs and other warrior nations of northern India, the observance of Suttee took on staggering proportions, since wives and concubines immolated themselves by the hundred. It became customary not only for wives, but for mistresses, sisters, mothers, sisters-in-law, and other near female relatives and retainers to burn themselves along with their deceased master. With the Rajputs, it evolved into the terrible rite of Jauhar, which took place in times of war or great peril in order to save the honor of the womenfolk of the clan, end quote. Again, the victims, through grammatical sleight of hand, are made to appear as the agents of their own destruction. The rite of Jauhar consisted in heaping all the females of the clan into the fire when there was danger of defeat by the enemy. Thousands of Hindu women were murdered in this way during the Muslim invasion of India. Their masters could not bear that they should be raped, tortured, and killed by foreign males adhering to, quote, different religious beliefs, rather than by themselves. The term custom, a casual and neutral term, is often used by scholars to describe these barbarous rituals of female slaughter. Clearly, however, they were religious rites. Some scholars assert that an unscrupulous priesthood provided the religious legitimation for the practice by rigging the text of the Rig Veda. We have a footnote. Many scholars claim that by changing the Sanskrit word agre, A-G-R-E, to agne, A-G-N-E-H, the priests converted a sentence from, quote, let the mother advance to the altar first, end quote, to, quote, let the mothers go into the womb of fire, end quote. As Peggy Holland pointed out, such scholars may be overzealous in their efforts to defend the, quote, pure and, quote, original sacred text, end quote. The perverse perspective which she had in mind is illustrated in the following statement by Thompson, begin quote, Suttee reached its most magnificent and least squalid form among the Rajputs, end quote. And end footnote. Magnificent widow burning. Priests justified the ritual atrocity by their interpretations of the law of karma. Furthermore, the typical mind-diverting orderliness of murderous religious ritual was manifested not only in the ceremonial bathing and dressing of the widows, but included other details of timing and placement. If the widow was menstruating, she was considered impure, and thus a week had to pass after the cessation of her period before she could commit Suttee. Since impurity also resulted from pregnancy, Suttee had to be delayed 2 months after the birth of the child. For the event itself, the widow... Ew! The widow was often required to sit with the corpse's head in her lap or on her breast. The orderliness is that of ritual, repetitive, compulsive, delusional. This horror show was made possible by the legitimating role of religious rite, which allows the individual to distinguish between the real self, who may be fearful and scrupulous, and the self as role performer. This schizoid perception on the part of those participating in the ritual carries over to the scholars who, though temporally or spatially distanced from the rite, identify with it rather than with the victims. Joseph Campbell placidly writes of the tortured and sacrificed woman, begin, quote, Suttee, the feminine participle of Sat, then, is the female who really is something in as much as she is truly and properly a player of the female part. She is not only good and true in the ethical sense, but true and real ontologically. In her faithful death, she is at one with her own true being, end quote. Thus, the ontological and moral problems surrounding female massacre are blandly dismissed. Campbell is simply discussing a social context in which, for a woman, to be killed is, quote, good and true, end quote, and to cease to exist is to be. His androcratically attached detachment from women's agony is manifested in paragraph after paragraph. After describing the live burial of a young widow which took place in 1813, this devotee of the rites of detached scholarship describes the event as, quote, an illuminating, though somewhat appalling, glimpse into the deep, silent pool of the Oriental archaic soul, end quote. What eludes this scholar is the fact that the, quote, archaic soul was a woman destroyed by patriarchal religion, in which he is a true believer, which demands female sacrifice. The bland rituals of patriarchal scholarship perpetuate the legitimation of female sacrifice. The social reality, unacknowledged by such myth masters, is that of minds and bodies mutilated by degradation. The real social context included the common practice of marrying off small girls to old men, since Brahmins have what has been called a, quote, strange preference for children of very tender years, end quote. Gross. Catherine Mayo, in an excellent work entitled with appropriate irony, Mother India, shows an understanding of the situation which more famous scholars entirely lack. Her work is, in the precise sense of the word, exceptional. She writes, begin, quote, that so hideous a fate as widowhood should befall a woman can be but for one cause, the enormity of her sins in a former incarnation. From the moment of her husband's decease till the last hour of her own life, she must expiate those sins in shame and suffering and self-immolation, chained in every thought to the service of his soul. Be she a child of 3 who knows nothing of the marriage that bound her, or be she a wife in fact, having lived with her husband, her case is the same. By his death she is revealed as a creature of innate guilt and evil portent, herself convinced when she is old enough to think at all of the justice of her fate, end quote. Child brides. Here we go. In order to understand the import of the distinction between a girl child / virgin and a, quote, wife in fact, end quote, we should realize that it has been traditional for Hindu men to force intercourse on extremely young female children. The trauma, physical and mental suffering, and stunting of body and spirit that this would cause in a young girl child can perhaps just barely be imagined by those who have not had to endure such an experience. With this effort of imagination, a feminist should read and reread carefully such dispassionate statements as the following from Vera Bola's The Subordinate Sex. He writes, begin quote, "Even if the husband died before consummation, which was not usually attempted until the girl was about 10, the girl was regarded as a widow and could not remarry," end quote. Begin quote, "Not usually attempted until the girl was about 10, end quote. The words let the information just slide past consciousness that of course it was / is often, quote, attempted earlier. Since this is a text often used in women's studies courses and contains much useful information, this detached quality of the writing requires special attention. It is, quote, writing that erases itself, end quote. The style of patriarchal scholarship, even at its best, continues and participates in the righteous rites of female slaughter / erasure. In this instance, what we are confronted with is not exactly untruth, but a partially suppressed truth, which becomes absorbed, belittled, and discarded in the reader's mind. Although the rape of female children by their fathers and other male relatives has been and is much more common in modern Western society than is generally acknowledged, those who do acknowledge the fact usually make some judgment about its morality, even though the criticism is often muted. In reading about the Indian situation, the Western reader has to shift mental gears in order to recognize that this violation has been considered legitimate because the older man was the child's husband. Bulaw's language blurs the obvious identification with child abuse so that the reader is almost compelled to think the husband was exercising virtuous self-restraint instead of raping a 10-year-old. Dirty old man behavior has social sanction. Upon the death of the dirty old man, the girl child could look forward to a life of perpetual misery if she was spared Suttee. What about before his death? Mayo presented evidence of a horror show that defies description, citing medical evidence from the Indian Legislative Assembly debates of 1922. Footnote: since the publication of Mayo's book in 1927, the laws in India have changed, but, as I indicated in the beginning of this chapter, legal changes mean very little. Although the Sarda Act of 1929 raised the legal age of marriage for girls to 14 years, in 1961 it was reported that 28% of girls between 10 and 14 were married. According to the 1971 census figures, 17.5% of females in the 10 to 14 age group were married. Legally, the minimum age of marriage for women was raised again from 14 to 16, but this does not correspond to deep or widespread changes in women's lives. Marriages of female children are still common. Nor is child marriage the only method by which female lives are stunted in India. The same issue of Youth Times, that would be 1975, reported that 21% of females are now literate, as contrasted with 45.3% of males. It is also asserted that 48.9% of rural births and 33.4% of urban births are attended by untrained, quote, dayis. In order to understand the full implications of this dry statistic, the reader should consult Mayo's Mother India for a lengthy description of the, quote, unspeakable dayis, quote, midwives from the, quote, untouchable caste, to whose filthy, brutal, grotesque, and frequently murderous ministrations the woman in childbirth is subjected. Since most females in India do become pregnant, whether they want to or not, the reality of dayis must be noted in order to comprehend the condition of female life. The following brief excerpt is from page 95. I guess that's in Mayo's book. Quote, "Such labor may last 3, 4, 5, even 6 days. During all this period, the woman is given no nourishment whatever. Such is the code, and the dayi resorts to all her traditions. She kneads the patient with her fists, stands her against the wall and butts her with her head, props her upright on the bare ground, seizes her hands and shoves against her thighs with gruesome bare feet, until, so the doctors state, the patient's flesh is often torn to ribbons by the dayi's long, ragged toenails. Or she lays the woman flat and walks up and down her body like one treading grapes. Also, she makes balls of strange substances, such as hollyhock roots, or dirty strings, or rags full of quince seeds, or earth mixed with cloves, butter, and marigold flowers, or nuts or spices, any irritant, and thrusts them into the uterus to hasten the event," end quote. Lest the reader misinterpret the fact that the dayis are females, imagining that this employment of the filthiest and most ignorant women to attend women in childbirth is not patriarchal in its context and intent, it is important to see the connections. Mayo writes of the total contempt for women's bodily functions, particularly her sexual functions. Quote, unclean. Okay, it's like the 3 quotes, unclean, and the one little quote. She, the young wife, so still in the quote, is in her pain unclean whatever she touches, and fit thereafter only to be destroyed. In the name of thrift, therefore, give her about her only the unclean and the worthless, whether human or inanimate. End quote. End footnote. So back to the text. I will cite just 4 of the cases of child wives brought to Indian hospitals as described in Mayo's appendix. Begin quote. A. Aged 9. Day after marriage. Left femur dislocated. Pelvis crushed out of shape. Flesh hanging in shreds. I, aged about 7, living with husband, died in great agony after 3 days. L, aged 11, from great violence done to her person, will be a cripple for life, no use of her lower extremities. M, aged 10, crawled to hospital on her hands and knees, has never been able to stand erect since her marriage. End quote. The list goes on. A female surgeon who took Catherine Mayo on a tour of a Purdah hospital in northeast India showed her a small child who had been a very bright pupil in a government primary school before she was sent to the home of the 50-year-old man to whom her family had married her. She was physically ravaged and had lost her mental balance. According to the doctor's account, begin quote, I have never seen a creature so fouled. Her internal wounds were alive with maggots. Meantime, her husband is suing her to recover his marital rights and force her back into his possession, end quote. This case was a child of a well-to-do, quote, educated, city-dwelling family. One might wonder what could be the reason/justification for these child marriages. Clearly, the Brahmins have seen nothing wrong with child brides. As one of them exclaimed during the Legislative Assembly debates of 1925, begin quote, to the Brahmin girl wife, the husband is the greater, truer, dearer benefactor than all the social reformers bundled together, end quote. Such godmen, of course, have the same urge to be, quote, benefactors of daughters, sisters, cousins, nieces. One of the justifications for child marriage and coitus with child brides was the fact that the father dared not keep his daughter at home lest she be damaged before she was off his hands. In this warped sense, her husband could be called her, quote, benefactor, since he rescued her from male relatives. Gross. Blaming the victim. Western scholars have acknowledged this problem, but in such a way that they have succeeded perfectly in blaming the child victim. For example, a 19th century Catholic priest scholar, the Abbé Dubois, wrote, begin quote, experience has taught that young Hindu women do not possess sufficient firmness and sufficient regard for their own honor to resist the ardent solicitations of a seducer, end quote. Yeah, off with that. The evidence offered by the Abbé for his view of the situation was the fact that mothers admitted they were afraid to leave their 11 and 12-year-old daughters at home and accessible to male relatives. The Christian priest thus perceives the situation through the lenses of his own tradition, which do not differ profoundly from the one he is observing. Footnote. In the mid-60s in Rome, during a conversation with Roman Catholic Archbishop Roberts, one of the, quote, radicals at the Second Vatican Council, who had lived for years in India, he, quote, informed me that Suttee is the, quote, logical conclusion, end quote, of female nature. Although that prelate was not actively promoting the practice, he was clearly expressing a basic agreement with its underlying assumptions shared by his own particular sect of patriarchal religion, end footnote. The logic of the evidence which he offers for the, quote, insufficient firmness, end quote, of Hindu girls may seem strangely familiar to feminists of Christian, quote, background, who will recall being told repeatedly by their, quote, confessors and ministers that the onus of sexual responsibility was on the girl, since males had, quote, stronger sex drives, end quote. It would be a mistake, however, to imagine that such ridiculous reasoning is restricted to the Christian priesthood, for the priesthood of scholars devoted to the rights of research has a more diverse membership. Thus, David and Vera Mace, commenting upon the Abbé's interpretation, appear to find nothing wrong with it, stating themselves that, quote, from an early age, girls in the East were accustomed to the idea that they could not be trusted to guard their own virtue, end quote. It requires cultivated obtuseness to fail to grasp the fact that an 11 or 12-year-old girl, particularly one who has had no training in self-defense and who has been trained to view males as gods, would hardly be able to fight off one or several full-grown rapist relatives. Such horrors have not ceased. Footnote, nor are they restricted to India. In April 1977, Time carried a story exposing a billion dollar pornography industry in the United States, specializing in children as subjects. And footnote, meanwhile, of the women in, quote, advanced countries who have some idea of the facts of sexism and some knowledge of, quote, women's history, end quote, far fewer glimpse the continued massacre that is masked by the rituals of research, which repeatedly recover the interconnected crimes of planetary patriarchy. By the dogma of female worthlessness and the device of, quote, blaming the victim, end quote, the priests of, quote, objective scholarship, end quote, continue to justify a context in which Suttee can be seen as reasonable and virtuous. From early childhood to old age, women are somehow made to appear at fault. Thus, P. Thomas, describing the miserable life of an Indian widow in the house of her deceased husband, writes that, begin quote, the mother-in-law, never too soft towards her daughters-in-law, could only look upon the widow as the virtual destroyer of her son, who would not have died, according to the then prevalent interpretations of the law of karma, if his wife was virtuous, end quote. Subtly, his style lays the blame on the traditional scapegoat, the mother-in-law. His use of the nominalized passive, quote, the then prevalent interpretations, end quote, hides the true agents of the atrocity by suppressing the question, just who created and enforced these interpretations which could infect the minds of women who were cast into the role of, quote, mother-in-law. Scholarly mystification continues to dull all sense of the unrightness of such rites as Suttee, regarding them with detached interest and making them appear isolated and unrelated to, quote, our culture. It thus keeps minds/imaginations in a state of readiness to accept similar or comparable practices which carry out the same program, the killing of female divinity, ultimately requiring the extinction of female life and will to live. Writing in 1960, David and Vera Mace masterfully muddied the issues illustrated in the Rite of Suttee for anyone searching in their book for insight. They wrote, begin quote, although custom and duty left many widows in the East no alternative but to suffer and even to die, it would be a grave injustice to explain all their sacrifices in these terms. In many, many cases, the widow walked into the fire proudly and by deliberate choice. This was her way of showing the depth of her affection, her devotion, her fidelity. It was a strange way, and to us a gravely mistaken one, but leaving aside the inappropriateness of the action and looking at the motive, dare we say that these women of the East knew less of true love than their Western sisters, end quote. The authors erase such obvious questions as why did not widowers walk, quote, proudly into the fire? And what does, quote, proudly mean? At times, hundreds, even thousands of women died in Suttee for one royal male. Who could speak of, quote, pride in dying for such godmen? How could anyone continue to use such language in the face of such frank admissions as the following statement of a Hindu, cited by Mayo, begin, quote, we husbands so often make our wives unhappy that we might well fear they would poison us. Therefore did our wise ancestors make the penalty of widowhood so frightful in order that the woman may not be tempted. End quote. The fear expressed here is clearly a terror of deserved retaliation, for among other things, a wife risked receiving lethal doses of venereal disease by penile injection. The Mace's use of the term injustice to describe an attitude of horror and outrage at the widow's fate is worse than absurd. It throws the reader off the track of asking who was/is responsible for the real injustice which she finds so horrifying. She is tempted to feel guilty for not understanding women of, quote, another culture, end quote. Mistaken and inappropriateness are bizarre terms in this context. They suggest that there was a real choice involved, and they belittle/distort the horrible reality. As for true love, devotion, etc., one can speculate that true masochism may be an ideal cherished more by these Western authors than by the widows whose options were so desperately narrowed. One can find endless examples of such patriarchal scholarship. My purpose here is to detect in these perpetuations of murder patterns whose effect is mental murder. This pattern detecting, the development of a kind of positive paranoia, is essential for every feminist searcher so that she can resist the sort of mind poisoning to which she must expose herself in the very process of seeking out necessary information. I have already suggested that the feminist searcher must be particularly aware of subtle mystification through language in books which take a liberal feminist approach and which have become institutionally acceptable materials for women's studies. Another example from Vern. Oh, his name is Vern. Earlier it was Vera. Vern Bolat, still a man, illustrates this kind of trap. He writes, begin quote, "Nowhere was the concept of inferiority of women more exemplified than in the custom of Suttee, the Hindu rite of suicide by widows by self-immolation," end quote. One might well ask whether any scholar would dare to describe the massacre of the Jews in Germany as a Nazi, quote, custom. It is important, It is important also to note that even such a liberal scholar uses the term suicide and self-immolation. It is abundantly obvious that if there was voluntariness, it consisted in, quote, choosing to jump from the frying pan into the pyre. Identification with the oppressor. If one seeks a probable explanation for such muddying language, I suggest that it may be found in the fact that the authors identify on some level with the agents of the atrocities, while being incapable of identifying with the victims, a subjective condition which is masked by the pose of, quote, objective scholarship, end quote. Feminists have learned to expect such blunting of sensibilities in male scholars. Unfortunately, however, many female scholars also use similar language, for the temptation to identify with the male viewpoint, which is legitimated by every field, is strong, and the penalties for not doing so often intimidate women into self-deception. One also finds in teaching women's studies that some female students will at first resist seeing obvious implications of the material. A professor of feminist ethics described her experience in presenting gynocidal atrocities to her class of undergraduate women. Although most were able to respond intellectually and emotionally to the reality, a minority insisted that the women who died of Suttee had, quote, free choice, end quote. No amount of evidence or reasoning from the rest of the class could move them. Footnote, this apparently is Jan Raymond's experience as a professor and also another professor of feminist studies, which she says, Andrea Collard, noted that students who resist such information will often use any cliche to avoid seeing the facts and their implications. Some common expressions of resistance are, quote, there must have been a reason, end quote, quote, things are different today, end quote, quote, I guess I'm just lucky, but, end quote, end footnote. However, it is important to recognize that the reasons for women's resistance to consciousness are different from those of men who actually or potentially hold power. For a woman to begin to allow herself to see is to begin the feminist journey, whose hazards she can intuit even before experiencing them. Yet another dimension of the significance of androcracy's woman-killing rituals is illustrated by Suttee. That is, the after effects, including both continued practice and scholarly legitimation of this, extended beyond official termination of the rite. Thus, it is not surprising that, quote, practical Suttee has continued to occur among widows in India, even though the public ceremony was legally banned in 1829. She has a footnote with, quote, practical Suttee. Catherine Mayo uses this expression to name instances where, quote, the newly widowed wife deliberately pours oil over her garments, sets them aflame, and burns to death in a connived at secrecy, end quote, end footnote. Deceptively, this is called, quote, suicide. The remarkable obtuseness of scholars regarding practical Suttee is illustrated in the writing of Benjamin Walker, who apparently finds Suttee distasteful only if the victim is, quote, unwilling. He writes, begin, quote, reports of eyewitnesses do record the heroism of some women who sought this form of death of their own free will. Quoting a number of instances from accounts of foreign travelers, Dr. A.S. Altekar speaks of his own sister, who has, as late as 1946, with indescribable fortitude, carried out her resolve, committing herself to the flames within 24 hours of her husband's death, in spite of the pressing entreaties of her relations, end quote. Given the immense, quote, knowledge of this scholar concerning the attitudes towards widows in India, his ignorance is demonic, though typical. It is enlightening to compare Walker's account of, quote, heroic Suttee with Catherine Mayo's realistic assessment of the situation. She writes, begin, quote, she has seen the fate of other widows. She is about to become a drudge, a slave, starved, tyrannized over, abused, and this is the sacred way out, quote, following the divine law, end inner quote. Committing a pious and meritorious act, in spite of all foreign-made interdicts, she escapes a present hell and may hope for a happier birth in the next incarnation, end quote. Damn. Resistance to feminist searchers. Since Catherine Mayo stands as a startling exception among scholars who have written about women in India, it is interesting to look at what happened to her work from the perspective of 50 years later. Mother India was published in 1927. It aroused a storm of protest in the East and in the West. There was a flurry of books and articles, replies and counter-replies. Titles of volumes that appeared in the controversy include My Mother India, Sister India, Father India, Living India, Understanding India, A Son of Mother India Answers, Neighbor India, Unhappy India, India, Stepmother, India, Its Character, A Reply to Mother India, Shiva or the Future of India. Obviously, Mayo had struck a nerve. As a result of her exploration and boldness, the literature multiplied. She herself wrote later books defending her position, Slave of Gods, 1929, and The Face of Mother India, 1937. The sort of defensiveness which Mayo's expose evoked is exemplified in My Mother India by Dalip Singh Sound. Defending the Hindu married woman's condition, he pictures her as, quote, dropping longingly into her husband's embrace with almost divine confidence, end quote. He speaks for his sister, who of course is not allowed to speak for herself, begin quote, and when the ideal of her childhood was realized, no wonder she found in his company that height of emotional exaltation which springs from the proper union of the sexes and is the noblest gift of God to man. The American girl thinks my sister married a stranger, but she had married an ideal, a creation of her imagination and a part of her own being, end quote. What the fuck? God. In fact, his sister had been trained to worship her appointed husband as a god. She had no choice. The contrast between such defensive rhetoric and Mayo's eyewitness account and analysis speaks for itself. The evaluation of Mayo's work and its impact has been left to such scholars as the authors of Marriage, East and West, who write, begin quote, the dust finally settled. It was conceded that Catherine Mayo's facts as facts were substantially accurate. It was recognized that she had taken up a serious issue and drawn attention to it, which had helped in some measure to hasten much-needed reforms. But at the same time, her book had done a grave injustice to India in presenting a one-sided and distorted picture of an aspect of Indian life that could only be properly understood within the context of the entire culture. End quote. Thus, Mayo is put in her place. We find here the familiar use of the passive voice, which leaves unstated just who conceded, who recognized. We also find the familiar balancing act of scholars, which gives a show of, quote, justice to their treatment of the attacked author. The qualifying expression, quote, as facts, added to, quote, facts, has the effect of managing to minimize the factual. Women who counter the patriarchal reality are often accused of, quote, merely imagining or being on the level of, quote, mere polemic. Here we have, quote, mere facts. Then the authors graciously concede that Mayo hastened, quote, much-needed reforms, end quote, which gives the impression that everything has now been taken care of, that the messy details have been tidied up. Then comes the peculiarly deceptive and unjust expression, quote, grave injustice to India, end quote. Mayo was concerned about grave injustice to living beings, women. Injustice is done to individual living beings. One must ask how it is possible to do injustice to a social construct, for example, India, by exposing its atrocities. We might ask such researchers whether they would be inclined to accuse critics of the Nazi death camps of, quote, injustice to Germany, or whether they would describe writers exposing the history of slavery and racism in America as guilty of, quote, injustice to the United States. The Maces go on to accuse Mayo of distorting, quote, an aspect of Indian life, end quote. But what is, quote, Indian life? Mayo is concerned not with defending this vague abstraction, presumably meaning customs, beliefs, social arrangements, etc., but with the lives of millions of women who happen to live in that part of patriarchy called, quote, India. The final absurdity in this scholarly obituary is the expression, quote, properly understood within the context of the entire culture, end quote. It is Catherine Mayo who demonstrates an understanding of the cultural context, that is, the entire culture, refusing to reduce women to, quote, an aspect. Her critics, 20 years after her death, attempted to absorb the realities she exposed into a, quote, broad vision, end quote, which turns out to be a meaningless abstraction. Feminist searchers should be aware of this device commonly repeated in the researchers' rituals. It involves intimidation by accusations of, quote, one-sidedness, so that others will not listen to the discredited searcher-scholar who refused to follow the, quote, rights, R-I-G-H-T, rights, R-I-T-E-S, the rights. The device relies upon fear of criticizing, quote, another culture, end quote, so that the feminist is open to accusations of imperialism, nationalism, racism, capitalism, or any other ism that can pose as broader and more important than gynocidal patriarchy. Thus, the just accuser becomes unjustly sentenced to erasure. Her life's meaning, as expressed in her life's work, is belittled, reversed, wiped out. Feminist speakers/spinsters should search out and claim such sisters as Catherine Mayo. Her books are already rare and difficult to find. It is important that they do not become extinct. Spinsters must unsnarl phallocratic, quote, scholarship, and also find our sister weavers/discoverers whose work is being maligned, belittled, erased, and deliberately forgotten. We must learn to name our true sisters and to save their work so that it may be continued rather than recovered, researched, and redone on the endless wheel of reacting to the atrocious lie which is phallocracy. In this discovering and spinning, we expand the dimensions of feminist time-space. In the process of seeking out these sister seekers/spinsters, it is essential to look at their own writings. Secondary sources, even those which one would hope to be just, are often misleading. The entry on Catherine Mayo by Mary F. Handelin in Notable American Women, for example, would throw the reader completely off track. Handelin gives a disproportionately small amount of space to Mayo's major work, Mother India, subtly discredits Mayo's motives, and gives no indication of the content or importance of the book. She distracts the reader by her use of pop psychology, stating that Mayo could confront her own sexual anxiety openly, quote, only in writing about distant places and alien cultures, end quote. This is an unsubstantiated and irrelevant personality attack, a device which could be used on any scholar who studies a foreign culture. In order to recognize its inappropriateness, one could look at biographical entries concerning male historians and anthropologists and note the absence of such speculations, as well as the focus upon content and importance of their works. The ultimate burial of the spinster, and Mayo was, quote, unmarried, a point stressed snidely by Handelin, takes place quietly. Only ashes can be found in such, quote, biographical entries, end quote, which softly intone the, quote, last rites, end quote, in the series of cross-cultural rituals designed to make us forget the murder and dismemberment of the goddess, that is, the killing of being, of the creative, divine life and integrity in concrete existing women. The pattern of the Sado-Ritual syndrome. In order to remember female divinity, it is important for hags/spinsters to look carefully at the pattern of the maze of gynocidal ritual illustrated in Suttee and its after effects. I have shown that there are a number of layers/levels of erasure. These are all designed to stop the journey of women finding ourselves, a journey which is questing, being. They are also designed to stop women from finding each other, for this is essential to finding ourselves. Thus, feminist searchers are blocked/divided from knowing their sisters who have been erased by ritual atrocities, and the rituals of research function to ensure this blockage, sending feminist would-be searchers repeatedly down blind alleys. The few who find their way at last through the maze are often too far ahead of their sister searchers for the latter to catch up. Wow. Meanwhile, the researchers have time to spread propaganda discrediting these discoverers, and their findings are effectively recovered. All of these elements are part of the Sado-Ritual syndrome. We are now in a position to perceive the operative pattern of this syndrome, which is illustrated in the ritual of Suttee and its after effects, and which we can find if we look wildly, listen keenly, over and over again in their other ritual atrocities of androcracy. 1. In the Sado-Ritual, we find first an obsession with purity. This obsession legitimates the fact that the women who are the primary victims of the original rites are erased physically as well as spiritually. These primary victims are often killed, as in the case of the rite of Suttee. In other cases, such as Chinese foot binding, as we shall see later, they are physically and psychically maimed. This original erasure obviously keeps the primary victims from being witnesses. In the name of, quote, purity, they are effectively silenced. Thus, the widow's sexual purity is, quote, safeguarded by ritual murder. In preparation for this ultimate purification, they are ceremoniously bathed, and care is taken to kill them at a, quote, pure time, that is, when they are not menstruating or pregnant. Thus, quote, society is purified of these, quote, wicked widows, and also of all traces of female rebelliousness, for the women and girl children who witness these events or hear of them must be perfectly brainwashed with terror of the same fate. 2. Second, there is total erasure of responsibility for the atrocities performed through such rituals. Those doing the destruction commonly have recourse to the idea that they are acting, quote, under orders, and, quote, or following tradition, serving a higher order. This allows the self as role carrier to commit acts which the personal/private self would find frightening or evil. 3. Third, gynocidal ritual practices have an inherent tendency to, quote, catch on and spread, since they appeal to imaginations conditioned by the omnipresent ideology of male domination. Moreover, since the patriarchal imagination is hierarchical, there is a proliferation of atrocities from an elite to the upwardly aspiring lower echelons of society. 4. Fourth, women are used as scapegoats and token torturers, for example, by the, quote, setting up of mother-in-laws as to blame for the widow's doom. This masks the male-centeredness of the ritualized atrocity and turns women against each other. 5. Fifth, we find compulsive orderliness, obsessive repetitiveness, and fixation upon minute details, which divert attention from the horror. In short, attention is focused upon what is proper and ceremonial, rather than upon the woman's horrible suffering and death. 6th, behavior which at other times and places is unacceptable becomes acceptable and even normative as a consequence of conditioning through the ritual atrocity. Such value judgments are easily interchangeable in the swinging pendulum society, characterized by consciousness split into false opposites. Thus, it is not surprising that the practice is desired and sometimes continued, even after it has officially/legally been terminated, as in the recurring instances of, quote, practical Suttee. 7th, there is legitimation of the ritual by the rituals of, quote, objective scholarship, despite appearances of disapproval. The basic cultural assumptions which make the atrocious ritual possible and plausible remain unquestioned, and the practice itself is misnamed and isolated from other parallel symptoms of the planetary patriarchal practice of female maiming and massacre. Jan Raymond has suggested that such scholarship could be called, quote, meta-ritual. The name is accurate, for this kind of writing not only records, that is, erases, the original rituals, but also provides, quote, explanations and legitimations for them, purporting to see beyond their materiality into their, quote, soul or meaning. This legitimation by the rights of research is an extension of the primordial gynocidal acts. The practitioners of these last rights reenact the original rights by erasing their meaning and by effacing those searchers who did weave their way through the mazes of research with integrity, discovering the forbidden fruit of their labors, that is, the facts. And that is the end of chapter 3. If you liked this reading, please like and subscribe. I will be back shortly with chapter 4. I already have that video ready. Thanks for listening.